Huh. Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Come take a walk through history with me. Now, the occupation and conquering of other countries is harmful to their growth. In the time of Napoleon, France tried to expand and spread its ideas to the other countries, and Germany's Third Reich also tried to take over Europe and force its ideas upon the other countries as well. Even after World War II, the United States occupied a zone of Germany and tried to force their idea of denazification on the people. All of these cases were harmful to the people of these countries and less beneficial. The French Revolution tore France apart, bringing with it chaos and death to the very people who had instigated it. Through all this turmoil rose Napoleon Bonaparte, a military man who seized power and ruled France with more power than even the king who the revolution had deposed. Though a dictator, Napoleon nevertheless instituted social change and restored order in France after the revolution had thrown the country into chaos, and his social policies, by making France more stable than it had been during the previous Republic and Directory, won his regime considerable support. However, while originally espousing the ideas of the revolution, Napoleon did exactly the opposite of what the revolution intended, and took away many of the rights the revolution had sought to create. With an iron grip, he maintained control of the French government, and the revolution came to an end with a more vigilant ruler than France had ever seen before. The consequences of revolution lead us to believe that Napoleon's reign on France led to more problems than it did sought solutions. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the French island of Corsica in 1769. It was not until 1778 that he moved to northern France to attend a private academy. Then when he was 16, he started out in the military as a second lieutenant. From this promotion, he decided that he wanted to rise up through the ranks and become French nobility. However, when the revolution started, Napoleon decided to leave the military. During this time, he returned to Corsica. While back home, Napoleon took their military and became a lieutenant. Soon he planned to take part in their politics as well. However, the Corsica government did not approve of his sympathetic approach to France and believed him to be too headstrong. Finally, Napoleon was forced to leave Corsica, and he and his family fled back to France. He joined the Jacobins in Corsica to rise up against the military dictatorship and continued to be a part of the group when he returned to France. He rose up once again into the ranks of the army quite quickly and led the French army in Italy. Soon after, he became the commander of the French interior of France. Whoopsie, that's a word. Soon after, he became the commander of the Army of the Interior of France and became aware of all the happenings in the French government. Napoleon's government was not entirely despotical, though, for he instituted what is now known as the Napoleonic Code. The code created laws and readdressed some of the grievances aired during the Revolution, such as forbidding privileges based on birth and allowing freedom of religion. This new age of equality would have been welcomed by many of the middle class who were wealthy but lacked the title of nobility. This equality would have been new to France, for which centuries were dominated by a system which granted privileges to persons simply because they were born to the right family. These changes reflected some of the ideas of revolution, and from this, some people have concluded that Napoleon was the man who saved the revolution. Moreover, Napoleon's reputation has been helped by the fact that the previous two forms of government have ended in such disillusionment, which makes Napoleon's seizure in power seem both admirable and necessary. From this perspective, if Napoleon had not taken the reins of revolution, France may have fallen into such turmoil that it would not have been salvageable, or more atrocities such as purges would have continued. If nothing else, then his seizure of power united France and kept the French from inflicting even greater harm on themselves. From this perspective, if Napoleon had not taken the reins of revolution, France may have fallen into such turmoil that it would not have been salvageable, for more atrocities such as the purges would have continued. If nothing else, then the seizure of power united France again and kept the French from inflicting greater harm on themselves. While his introduction as a political leader of France may have re-established France and saved the nation from internal destruction, it does not justify Napoleon's warmongering. Instead of simply rebuilding France, he turned his attention to France's neighbors and began invading other countries. While this may have put the power of France on display, it also diverted much of the people's attention, not to mention the country's finances, to the war effort. As long as the French armies were victorious, though, Napoleon was loved by the people and those who fought underneath him. He extended his empire far across Europe, which, while the citizens of France may have a lot of victories, stretched his empire thin, making it susceptible to attacks from many of the previously conquered countries. It seems unnecessary for Napoleon to have gone so far as he did with his empire building, for it does not seem like expanding such lengths would have provided France with many necessary resources, and so the campaigns appear to have been more of a quest for personal glory, and to demonstrate to the world the extent of his personal power.
When the revolution in France had been resolved and finally stabilized, a reasonable leader might be expected to prioritize the security of his nation instead of search for personal glory.
Consolidation of his government might have served him better, for he would have been able to focus more on the social policies of France and develop the nation internally by improving the country's social and legal institutions. While the introduction of the Napoleonic Code helped to establish what was law and made it more clear as to what was considered criminal, the charges undertaken by Napoleon stopped short of institutionalizing these ideas advocated by the Revolution, such as the establishment of a governing system, which would allow for peaceful transitions of ruling bodies through voting. Instead, he instituted a line of succession similar to that of a monarchy, with his son being next in line for rule.
After the French Revolution, there was a state of disarray which was finally put to an end by Napoleon Bonaparte. However, was his bringing to an end of the Reign of Terror and the French Revolution a blessing to the people of France? Though fears of the Revolution were over, in their place was a new man in charge of the government, which at the same time that it gave citizens more rights, deprived them of their ability to choose who would lead them. However, compared to the fear from before the Revolution, this must seem appealing. In the end, Napoleon overextended his reach and he cared more for his personal glory than the safety of his people. He sacrificed many lives just so he could prove his superior military and attain a name for himself for the annals of history. While this may not be uncommon for leaders, Napoleon's warmongering led to his eventual defeat and later exile. France was once again put under a monarch, which just led to more problems for France. With the introduction of Charles X to the throne, the Constitution of France was seen as being too liberal, and the new advancements in equality in the government were not to his liking. This meant for Charles reinstituting some of the common practices of the old French kings, which made him unpopular with many of the French. The attempts to bring back the old regime were fought against by the people of the chambers of France and were not passed. It was only in due time for the people to once again rise up against the monarchy and fight for the liberty that they sought. If this liberty had been set up earlier by Napoleon, future bloodshed over the government may have been averted and a more peaceful transition into a republic could have been achieved. However, despite his incorporation of revolution ideas in the Napoleonic Code, his warmongering led to the re-establishment of the monarchy, which would strip away the long fight for rights. Napoleon could have been a true savior to France, yet decided to place his own agenda first, ultimately leading to the future problems with the French government.
And part of the reason why Napoleon was so strong and had an easy time rising to power in politics and military, because he knew very well how to speak to an army. When he came to speaking to a war and strategy to his troops, he encouraged them to have their strongest self in battle.
For example, when he showed up to his command in Italy, he realized that his men were all very sickly, underfed, and underdressed. However, Napoleon rallied up all of his troops and talked to them in such a way that was encouraging enough to make them willing to fight and encouraged enough pride in their country to fight and win the battle. He said, "Soldiers, you are naked, badly fed. Rich provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness?" These words alone were encouragement enough to guide his troops to battle and win. As far as his strategies and tactics go for leading his army into battle, Napoleon's strategies have been studied ever since at many well-known military schools around the world. Napoleon knew how to fight under many environmentally challenging conditions and was able to command leaders older and more experienced than himself. One of his most well-known military tactics for fighting armies that had a greater number of soldiers than his was to centralize his troops and charge directly down the middle of the opposing army to split the group in half, therefore making it easier for them to take them on. He depended on his troops' agility and aggression. Napoleon was so successful because he envisioned all possible situations before the battle took place and developed how he would approach the situation. Oftentimes, if the enemy had fewer troops, then he would surround them and then make it so they could not escape his army.
Additionally, Napoleon had a natural strong will. He grew up with a militarily savvy father and a strong-willed mother.
Napoleon himself was a strong-willed individual who presented himself as an invincible force during battle. He was able to hide weakness and present his best self at all times. This would be important for him because he grew up with strict rules and disciplines that would later encourage his attitude towards his determination and ambition. Also, this would contribute to the way other countries viewed France during this time. Napoleon's strong front was important when trying to conquer other countries because they saw him as a threat. Something that also contributed to the way his own country viewed him was that he did have a deep devotion to France. Even though growing up he was not always devoted to it, his time in military school and serving the French army caused him to have great pride in his country.
Napoleon was able to gain people's trust by following what they wanted and gaining power in Europe for France. Now, his reign affected much of Europe, and many of his war strategies are still in effect today. Napoleon's take on imperialism can be compared to Germany when Adolf Hitler took power in the 20th century. Napoleon and Hitler were both experienced leaders who were able to conquer and take control of much of Europe very quickly. However, they both failed in one major campaign that would lose them both of their wars and thus change history forever.
Both of their invasions of Russia ended in disaster, and after losing many troops and spending lots of time and resources, they were required to retreat with their tails between their legs.
They attempted to invade England, but were pushed away by the incredibly strong Royal Navy, and instead of this, they turned their eyes east and decided that invaded Russia would be the best choice.
In June of 1812, Napoleon began his invasion with 600,000 men and 50,000 horses. His plan was to invade quickly and conquer Moscow as soon as possible. He knew that the Russian military was much smaller and weaker and could easily be defeated in battle. One historian is quoted as saying, "Napoleon had no preconceived ideas of a plan of campaign. He was certain that no army the Russians had raised could resist him in battle. This overconfidence is what led to his demise." Napoleon's plan was to invade quickly, with his troops heading straight for Moscow. His quick advance came with problems. Firstly, his soldiers marched faster than his supply lines, and thus were required to stop multiple times in order to allow the supplies to catch up. Napoleon got tired of waiting and wanted to speed up, so he told his troops to live off the land and take food from farms and houses of captured cities and land. However, the Russians, in their constant retreat, continually burned and destroyed farms and cities that they had left behind.
The incredible size of Napoleon's army was one of his major downfalls. As said by a historian, an army large enough to conquer Russia is too large to feed in Russia. The complete starvation of his army, along with the fact that the Russian army never fully engaged Napoleon's, meant that by the time he arrived in Moscow in September, he had half the military that he had when he left.
Like the other cities that he had passed by, Moscow was abandoned and set aflame. After waiting for weeks in an attempt to draw the Russian military out for a battle he knew he could not lose, Napoleon decided to retreat in October 1812. This long walk back through the wet, cold, and destroyed western side of Russia is where he lost even more men than he did walking in. By the time he returned to Poland in December of that same year, he had lost over 500,000 soldiers, and this marked the beginning of the end for the French emperor.
His failure to know that he was not invincible, and his underestimation of the length of time he would be at war, and non-consideration of the harsh Russian winter, led to his destruction. Adolf Hitler had a similar story to Napoleon, where he also was very confident in his military power, even saying,
"My pact was meant only to stall for time, and gentlemen, to Russia will happen just what I have practiced with Poland. We will crush the Soviet Union."
He stated this in 1939, already knowing that he was going to invade Russia years before he actually would. Using the Battle of Britain as a disguise, he started planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. However, when it was time to invade, Hitler hit a roadblock.
The Yugoslavian government had been overthrown, and Italy had failed to capture Greece in time. Thus, Hitler decided to take military action and invaded both Greece and Yugoslavia in April of 1941, with plans to invade Russia in May. This invasion pushed Barbarossa back a month, which meant a greater chance for Hitler's army to have to fight in the harsh Russian winter. When the invasion finally began on June 22, 1941, Hitler caught the Russians completely by surprise.
Even with this surprise, the Russians were able to retreat very quickly, and just like they did with Napoleon, they destroyed cities, railroads, bridges, and anything else they thought that Hitler would be able to use in his conquest toward the east.
Hitler had a few main differences to Napoleon in his strategy, namely splitting up his troops into 3 major advances and telling his troops not to retreat from Stalingrad. He, however, failed to see the main problem with Napoleon's plan, which was the winter that would also entirely decimate his army. With the delay in the beginning of the invasion and another delay to send tanks to a southern army, Hitler's troops had to stay in Russia over winter, for which they were not prepared. His tanks lacked antifreeze and thus literally were frozen in their tracks, while his soldiers lacked winter clothes and had many problems with their guns and other equipment in the bitter cold. The final blow came in early December when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and the Russians began to push the Germans back from Moscow. Hitler was starting to lose on the Eastern Front and now had the distinct possibility of war starting on a new Western Front. His overconfidence that he could take not only Russia quickly but also Yugoslavia and Greece meant that he ended up spending time in Russia a month later than he had to.
Thus, his overconfidence and lack of worry for the Russian winter meant that in December of 1941, Hitler began to lose World War II. If they had not invaded, both of their armies were stronger than the Russian equivalent, and there is a possibility that they could have held off any Russian invasion in the future, or even invaded Russia when they were stronger. However, their empires would soon crumble and the continent of Europe would undergo a massive shuffling of borders, treaties, and people in the coming decades. Since war was no longer occurring in Europe, this rearrangement would have to occur diplomatically. Now, diplomacy has always been a key role in determining the outcome and lasting effects of warfare on nations in the course of history. These reparations following war often include peace treaties drafted between the two conflicting parties to settle disputes and arrive upon court of terms. Treaties and other related peace preparations have been used throughout history to settle complications regarding land occupation, especially if the internal borders shifted during the course of warfare. Two of the most notorious wars in history, World War I and II, included territorial changes implemented by these peacetime treaties and post-war reparations.
World War I occurred July 1914 through November 1918 and included many European countries in the conflicts and warfare. Multiple treaties were written following the end of the war to settle remaining disputes, and many include declarations of territories and restoration to pre-war borders. Austrian Republic. About two-thirds of the Austrian territory acquired during World War I was lost due to the treaty's provisions. However, the Austrian Empire didn't completely suffer, as the treaty also gave Burgenland, German-speaking Hungarian provinces, to the Austrian Empire. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in the summer of 1919 by Germany and the Allied powers of World War I. The treaty served to delegate post-war reparations following the official ending of World War I months earlier with the signing of the armistice. The treaty served as a major land loss for Germany, transferring some of the newly acquired German Empire land to other countries. In total, Germany lost 65,000 kilometers squared from the treaty. Furthermore, the Treaty of Versailles prohibited a union between Germany and Austria, though come World War II, this demand would be disobeyed by Nazi Germany. Chaos ensued in Europe once more years later in the form of the Second World War. Fighting began in 1935 and ravaged for years in Europe until the victory of the Allies in September 1945. Before Nazi Germany surrendered in Europe, plans were already underway for reconstruction following the end of the war. The Yalta Conference of February 1945 brought together the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Union leader Joseph Stalin to discuss the organization and occupation of post-war Germany. This conference played the central role in the division of Germany, following the fall of the Third Reich, establishing a division of Germany and Berlin into four occupied regions controlled by American, Soviet, French, and British forces. The Polish post-war border was also finalized, and Poland would be given back land previously controlled by Germany. Following the Allies' victory in Europe, the bulk of the peace negotiations signed as the Paris Peace Treaties occurred during the Paris Peace Conference of 1946. The negotiating nations included the Allies, United States, Soviet Union, France, and United Kingdom, and Italy, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland. The treaties declared each country as their own sovereign states, though they removed the land acquired by each during the war, restoring the countries closer to their pre-war borders. Land loss was given back to the original countries from which they had been acquired. Italy suffered additional losses, losing its East and North African colonies and pre-World War II Italian land to France.
As mentioned, occupations of country by other nations in the context of warfare are common. Following the loss of World War II, the Allies took control and occupied Germany. The United States tried to impose its own views and laws in the process of denazification in this war.
Although the American sector of Germany experimented with various approaches, they damaged the country more than they fixed it. In fact, denazification was a complete diplomatic failure. One of these failures was that 28% of the Germans had been dismissed from their jobs because they had been higher up in the Nazi regime. The intent was to remove Nazi influence as a whole, and as a result, many of the educated Nazis now only qualified for manual labor, thus losing their knowledge and slowing the recovery of Germany as a whole. The German people began to dislike the idea of denazification because of events like these. They saw injustice, and they saw that no one was doing anything to stop it. The Germans also resented the idea of denazification, because the Americans were only concerned with whether someone was a Nazi or not. Though Germany needed to have Nazi power removed from it after World War II, the way denazification was done caused damage and hindered the country's growth and development. In conclusion, the effort of occupation hinders the recovery of a country immediately after a war, and ends up being a failure because it harms more people than it helps. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your journey through history.